At the age of 44, I had never ridden a long-distance train before, ever, that I could remember my whole life. So the sleeperette was a dose of oddness I definitely had not foreseen. The sleeperette is a tiny rectangular enclosure in which there's only room to either stand or lie down on the flat surface created when two opposing cushioned seats are manually flattened, pressing against each other. When this ersatz bed has been fashioned, even the changing of clothes becomes a bit of an adventure in balance and maneuver. I was fascinated by the little engineering gimmicks that had been devised to make my overnight stay in that hutch possible. A sink that folded out from the wall, an overhead bunk with an actual harness should a passenger worry about tumbling out when the train swung around a curve or stopped suddenly. I decided I'd pass on the little, tastefully concealed toilet and use one of the many located throughout the train. Imaginative instructional diagrams gave me a crash course on how to be self-sufficient as Amtrak rolled me north toward Boston. All of it, I judged after all of 60 seconds, was 10 times more pleasant than air travel, especially after the Portland incident. But almost immediately after removing the plastic wrap from the thin, trifold blue mattress tucked into the bunk at eye level, I was enshrouded by disquieting feelings. My skin became unnaturally warm, and a sharp pain dug into the very center of my temple. I struggled with the bed mechanism's demand for unusual physical force and collapsed onto the mattress as the pain intensified, then seemed to break apart in mossy patches that flowed through my veins toward my feet, spreading prickly heat. By the time the train actually pulled out of Atlanta at 10:10 p.m., it felt like a powerful but heinously familiar flu had seized hold of me. My body was shaken gently by the train's all but silent movement along the tracks. Amy called my cell at 10:20, and wiping sweat away from my forehead with my shirt sleeve, I fumbled around to press one of the many recessed light buttons set into the walls around me, sitting up as best I could. Someone was once murdered in this very sleeper car, I told Amy before she could even speak on the other end of the line. She was silent for a very intentional moment. I knew the question she would ask, so I irritated her further by answering it almost before it fell from her mouth. Yes, I'm certain, I affirmed. I felt it as soon as I walked in. She was right to chastise me, certainly, for allowing the sensations to overcome me, for not resisting them to the fullest. This trip was supposed to be relaxation. If I walked into the Old North Church catacombs on Wednesday with distracting visuals festering in my brain, it could be unsafe, even disastrous. My mind and body needed to be utterly clear for the challenge ahead of us. Yes, I told her. By morning I would be all right. I'd just try to get some sleep. But sleep didn't happen at first. I got up after an hour of staring at the chipped paint on the bottom side of the overhead bunk and pulled the chessboard-sized folding lap table out of the wall. I didn't see any real harm in performing an attraction. It wasn't going to make me feel that much sicker, deplete my internal battery any more than had already happened. I closed my eyes and let the train rock me gently as it moved through Toccoa, Georgia. The sleeping world of the rural South passed by my big window, offering glimpses of its industrial yards, its weed-smothered back alleys. An old man with an oxygen clip below his nose, sitting on a back porch that had entirely caved in on one side, watched the train go by in the dark, his mouth open, seeming to question. Within 5 minutes, I knew from the floating patchwork of seemingly nonsensical shapes and shadows spiraling through my brain that the person who had been killed in that sleeper car had definitely been a man. The movement of those shapes and shadows had a sound like a series of racquetballs hitting the walls of an undersea chamber. But nothing more would come until I rose and began the touch process. I ran my hands with great care along the seat cushions, the window, the thin carpeting on the floor. The vibrations of the train as felt through that carpet calmed me somewhat. If anyone had passed by the sleeperette and seen me through a gap in the cheap curtains, they would have seen me on my hands and knees, fingers splayed wide, their tips dancing lightly and leading my palms, spider-like, even into the skinny sliver of a closet. Yes, the closet, only 6 mere inches wide, had played a part somehow, I felt. By the time the train glided past a long, shuttered textile mill with the words, "Welcome to Pretty Little Pendleton," stenciled on one of its work huts, perhaps decades ago, I had come to understand that the murdered man was blind as well. Blind, but not helpless. Not at all. Beyond that, my concentration began to waver, and the necessary connection between my limbic system and the evocation electricity in the air all around me began to fray. Fatigue, stress, even the movement of the train played a part in that fracturing. I had to stop for now. I stared down for a time at the 2 simple descriptors I had written and circled in my notebook during the trance. The PA system coughed a burst of static above me, and the rocky voice of a male trip attendant pierced the lovely night silence. The attendant informed all passengers that Hamlet would be the next stop, and those wishing to disembark should make their way to the doors at the rear ends of the cars and watch for uniformed personnel. He had a curious way of inserting lengthy pauses between words that should have connected quite naturally, and it made this innocuous announcement sound as if he were narrating a mournful poem about long, lonesome travel. It was 12 minutes past midnight. Beyond my window, someone in a long white overcoat stood behind the crossed barrier arms at a quiet road intersection, their blinking lights only intermittently splashing a red glow across the person's face. It was a young woman. She looked sad. The Amtrak trip attendant's unusual voice followed me into my dream. My mind transformed him into the captain of the 737 I'd taken from St. Paul to Portland 6 weeks before. The plane was just a few minutes from touchdown, the dense fog outside my window again concealing the entirety of the world. The captain's PA announcement apologized for the holding pattern we'd been stuck in for the past 20 minutes due to a developing weather situation to the east. In real life, his voice had been flinty and weak. Now, in the dream, the trip attendant spoke the same words with unusual gravity and a cruel sense of irony. "You may be alarmed when the fog breaks for just a moment," he told us all over the PA, "and you see the control tower pass just 100 feet to the left. Those in first class with keen hearing may even hear a snippet of the automated ground alert in the cockpit before the pilots correct their disastrous altitude error at the last second, and the child in seat 5G shrieks in fear. It all then played out just as it had in real life, with the plane banking suddenly, pulling up for an emergency go-around about 10 seconds before it would have crashed. The only real difference from what actually happened was that it hadn't been a child screaming from seat 5G. That was me. I awoke at 2 a.m. Blood was running freely from my nose, no surprise. I got up in the dark, dabbed it away over the creaky fold-out sink, and splashed cold water on my face. I felt woozy and collapsed again with my head resting against the window pane, looking out over the territory north of Gastonia, North Carolina. I kept the lights off and gazed out at the trees whipping past the window in the dark, sometimes actually brushing the glass, their sameness broken only by brief grassy clearings where comm towers marched off into the horizon. I let my mind drift, trying to heal myself from the difficult evening. Man, said the first circled word on the top page of the notebook I kept close in my lap. Blind, said the other. The small town of Monroe became visible at 3:30, all its residents long asleep. The windows of the library beside the train tracks bore posters advertising its summer reading program. Winnie the Pooh and Severus Snape, both absorbed in hardcovers of their choice. Monroe's water tower loomed over a community baseball field like a palace guard, achieving a lovely sort of nobility in these late hours. The train slowed as we went past an industrial dairy with a winking cow painted on one of its storehouses, and I found myself for many minutes melting into the shadows that swam among the property's maze of unpainted, curiously shaped buildings. It was rare that taste needed to play a part in an attraction, but I was convinced I could understand nothing more until I brought it into the process. I made sure I still had one of the half-sized complimentary bottles of Amtrak-branded water handy, and crouched before that closet again. This time I was more careful to arrange the curtains so as to block all possible view into the sleeperette, pressing the Velcro tabs affixed to the fabric together just so. I moistened my tongue and drew it slowly up the metal seam running up the front corner of the closet, and the thin bar supporting 2 plastic coat hangers. Then I popped a mint into my mouth and swigged it down with more water, preparing to lick the sleeperette's door handle and probably each light button. But quite suddenly a single vivid image danced effortlessly through my brain. I saw the murdered man's hand reach up from the floor at the extremity of his agony to grab one of the hangers high above, coming up pitifully short. He had been out of oxygen by then. I woke Amy in New York with my call, the reception quite poor. She picked up and said curtly, "What have you seen?" It only happened a day ago, I told her, trusting my instincts as much as I could. I had been wrong before, and the time frame seemed improbable, but I spoke the words anyway. "I'm meeting you halfway," she responded immediately. "Get off the train somewhere with an airport. You're not well." But she had sometimes been wrong too. Even with decades of experience, wrong was a way of life for us. And I hadn't been well for a long time now. So I stayed on board in the sleeperette just a little longer. I looked down at the notebook in my lap, and under the words man and blind, I wrote the word psychic, completing the triumvirate of qualities I believed belonged to the victim who had died on the floor 16 inches away from the spot where I currently sat. The technical cause of death, I thought, may have been strangulation, but at some point during the struggle, there had been a hammer. A hammer had come out. A decent forensics team would be able to find faint traces of blood in the carpet, no matter how the assailant had scrubbed afterward. But I was confident no one even knew yet that man was missing. 4:15 a.m. Beyond the limits of some town whose name I will never know, a hilly orchard lay under the starless sky. Dozens upon dozens of rows of diminutive trees bearing fruit of a type I couldn't discern. The symmetry applied to their planting was not quite perfect, all done by feel maybe, by instinct the old way. This was not some industrial expanse, but a family farm. The train passed close enough so that I could make out a single wooden basket nestled beside one of the trees closest to the edge of the field. Who knew when that basket would be touched again by some tired laborer? At that very simple sight, I felt tears forming in my eyes, and surprised by this strange, singular riot of emotion, I turned away from the window to collect myself. It was a sense of loss I was feeling. I realized at that moment what the train was giving me that a lifetime of rapid and hurried flights had concealed. A sense of a long journey's true progress. The slow tick of miles that moved me through real geographical space in real human time, among genuine structures and genuine lives so vastly different from my own. I suddenly wanted to reclaim every moment I'd lost hurtling forward at high altitude, to see every mundane sight on the ground I had always blithely flown over, and feel my slow-moving blood gradually synchronize with the faint pulse of the land over the course of days, weeks. I had missed so much, traveled too fast, all my life, and for that I almost cried. But that was all swept away in a sudden tide of unwelcome knowledge. The moment the train attendant's distinctive voice crackled overhead once again, telling me that we would be a half-hour late arriving in High Point, the rest of the picture I'd been laboring to decipher clicked into place. The notebook was lifted again, the pen was uncapped. Beneath the words man, blind, and psychic, I drew a long line connecting to a newly added phrase that referred not to the killed, but to the killer. It's him, I wrote. This I circled twice. The attendant coughed over the PA, did not apologize for it, and went on. There was the non-smoking policy to cover again, and this time he paused between the words federal and law for so long, it seemed the audio system had simply sputtered and failed. It could be that he had been drinking, for he had already told us passengers hours before that he would not be making any comment beyond brief mention of major upcoming stops. Didn't want to wake anyone unnecessarily. Yet here the murderer was, at 4:30 in the morning, rambling on about smoking and the eventual reopening of the snack car. This last bit of information was somehow delivered with the gravity of an actor sinking to his knees on a stage to speak Macbeth's lines about the futility of existence. I was then seized with a final paroxysm of comprehension that made my entire upper body quake gently with its force. I dropped the pen to the floor and bent to pick it up again. I wrote a second phrase beneath the one I had just added, my penmanship suddenly uneven. My pulse rate quickening, I quickly shut off the only bulb illuminating the room and eyed the lock on the sliding door that separated me from the hallway 36 inches away. That lock, mass-produced somewhere the cheapest way possible, looked hopelessly ineffectual. Knows that I know, I had written, and I left the page freely exposed as I laid the notebook on the folding table and tried to think what my options for a weapon were. The train whispered past a long abandoned and boarded bingo hall, set well off a winding dirt driveway, and then a veterans cemetery, guarded by an enormous, almost despotic stone statue of an owl. What did that mean? I managed to wonder through my fear. What was the symbolism there? I wanted to understand. From my cloak of darkness, I gazed at the owl until the train suddenly plunged into a dense forest-scape once again, and the 3 emphatic rappings I was waiting for sounded on my sleeperette's fragile door.